Good afternoon to you all, and welcome to the webinar Farm to Fork Strategy and the Impact on the Fruit Juice Industry. My name is Water and I'm the Secretary General of the European Fruit Juices Industry Association. We are, since 1962, the representative association defending the interest of the fruit juice industry, and this ranging from fruit processors to those bottling the juice. I will be in the coming 2 days your host, and this webinar is co-organized with SGF International. SGF International has been set up in 1974 by the industry itself to monitor the quality and the authenticity of juices. The farm to fork strategy provides or aims to provide a healthy and nutritious diet to consumers stemming from a fair and sustainable food processing. Juices are all natural agricultural products, and so sustainability is in our DNA. So I'm very interested to listen to all the presentations from the speakers. After every presentation, there will be a possibility to have some questions. For this, please go to Slido. You can scan with your mobile or your tablet the QR code for this Slido, or just follow the link on your laptop. Now I'll give the floor to Dr. Alejandra Solis. She is the Science and Technical Manager of AIJN, and she will be moderating this session of today. Alejandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Guter, for the kind introduction. 2020 has been a year full of challenges in all sectors around the world. Food industry has not been the exception. The pandemic has put us all into rethinking how we are going to address future challenges that will come with COVID-19. And together with these new challenges, there are also important changes that, in one way or the other, will modify the way that the food sector, and in particular juice industry, will have to deal when it comes to raw materials and specifically the fruit and vegetables that our industry uses. In particular with these changes, we will have to be aware of how to be compliant with the new strategy that the European Commission is implementing, that is, the Farm to Fork strategy, that, as it is conceived, has fundamental targets that the food sector will have to comply with. These fundamental targets contemplate farming practices that at the same time will be intrinsically related to the common agricultural policy that ultimately will support for the raw materials produced become sustainable. One of those targets is the so-mentioned pesticide reduction by 50%, as well as the implementation of the concept of IPM, also known as integrated pest management, together with the use of digital farming technology. However, the question is how the food sector, and in particular the providers of the raw materials to juice industry, will face this. How juice industry will face these changes that farmers will need to implement in the raw materials we consume for the manufacture of juice industry. These questions will be answered today and tomorrow by the experts that we will have in this today's webinar. We hope you enjoy this event that AIJN and SGF International have prepared for you. And with this brief speech, I would like to introduce the agenda for today that will comprise 4 topics that will include Digital Farming, Dr. Doris McQuarrie, Program Officer, DG Agri, Research and Innovation, European Commission. GMO, Dr. Leslie G. Fernbank, Chair in Sustainable Agriculture, School of Biology, University of Leeds. Biological Control Products to Combat Pests, Dr. Jarken Cole, Senior Scientist Plant Pathology, Wageningen University and Research, and Consumer Demand for Organic Agriculture, Eric Gall, Deputy Director and Policy Manager, IFOAM Organics Europe. And now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Doris McQuarrie. Dr. McQuarrie works for the European Commission in the Directorate General for the Agriculture and Rural Development since July 2019. She is focused on the digitalization of the agricultural sector and rural areas and at research and innovation. She completed her PhD in agricultural policies at the Martin Luther University, Halle-Wittenberg, in Germany. and holds a master's diploma in environmental planning from the Technical University of Munich. She also holds positions at the European Environment Agency, the German Permanent Representation, the German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture, the European Network for Rural Development Contact Point, the Germany-based Leibniz Institute for Agricultural Development in Central and Eastern Europe, the Centre of Rural Economy in Newcastle, UK, and the European Academy in Bolzano, Italy. She has experiences in the implementation of the Common Agricultural Policy in several member states, including Romania, Italy, and Germany. She served as experts in policy design, agriculture, and rural and regional development in projects commissioned by the World Bank, UNEP, and FAO. And with this impeccable resume, I give now the floor to Dr. McCart.
Thank you so much, Alejandra. Dr. McCart, can you just make active your camera so we can start with the presentation? And if so, then we can start now with the presentation of Dr. McCart. Apparently there are some technical problems, but please do start.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Yes, many thanks for uploading this presentation. Thanks for the kind introduction, and I think you already provided the first overview of the Farm to Fork strategy. As announced, I would like to focus today on the role of digitalization and digital technologies in farming will play in the implementation of the Farm to Fork strategy. As it is the first presentation this afternoon, I would like to provide also a rough overview of the Farm to Fork strategy in general and its implications and its approach. I think that it's important to have the context and then to follow up on the discussion. Could you please switch to the next slide? Thank you. So the Farm to Fork strategy is an inherent part of the Green Deal, the big announcement by the European Commission to make Europe the first continent by 2050 to be climate neutral. And the Farm to Fork strategy, you know, agriculture as a big land user and we all as consumers has a key role to play in achieving the objectives of the European Green Deal and also on the sustainable development goals, looking beyond because you as organization have a global perspective. So it's one stepping stone to achieve both, but more concrete as a Farm to Fork strategy. If we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Then we will see that sustainable food systems and sustainable societies are at the heart of the Farm to Fork strategy. And what is important to note here is the integrated approach, integrated in so far that we do not only foster on environmental sustainability, but also on social sustainability and economic sustainability, and try to link it in one strategy. So you will find here the different details, what the different dimensions mean. But if we go already to the next slides, then I can detail it a little bit more. At the current stage, if we analyze our food system and would like to achieve those three dimensions and the objectives I just touched upon, then we will find that we have many challenges. From the consumer's perspective and social sustainability, we have, for instance, a problem as a global perspective as regards health and healthy nutrition. So on the one hand, we have populations where we have too little food. We have not even food security achieved. On the other side, we have the challenges in other societies of obesity. So there's a discrepancy to achieve a healthy food system. To the same time, it has also to be a fair food system. Fair in that regard that, for instance, the farmers have fair prices, that the consumers have fair prices, and that it goes hand in hand and is a balanced system. And then, as a key and at the heart, you see it here in the middle of the slide, the sustainability dimension. Sustainability is not only climate change, which is often linked to the Green Deal as a keyword, but also to reduce emissions and preserve biodiversity. So that is a rough overview. For sure, for all the continents, you could outline different challenges to the food system and go into more detail, and further information is also provided at the end of the presentation. If we could go to the next slide, please. To sum up, here are 4 core elements from the Farm to Fork strategy. It's the climate footprint, which is fostered to be reduced. It's a global transition, and I think that is important to emphasize here today, as we have here a global community. So it's not only about achievements in Europe, but to achieve a global transition towards sustainability from farm to fork. And also, as you well know, food chains are global. And I will go into detail how that could potentially be achieved. Important in the context of digitalization is tap into new opportunities. Innovation will be a key to achieve the objectives and linking them all together, for instance, economic and sustainable objectives. And overall, resilience for the overall system is an important indicator for linking the 3 dimensions, social, environment, and economic, together. Next slide, please. So what does it mean concrete? I will not go into detail here, I have only 20 minutes, but you can see here some examples how it's fixed and what is the intervention logic and how detailed operational objectives are actually defined. So it's not only staying at the headlines, but the farm to fork strategy becomes more concrete and operationalize it. So, and at the end in the box, you can see food security and food safety are at the cornerstones of our food system, and they never be compromised. So that is one link of going along with the implementation of the farm to fork strategy. And the next slide, please. So what is key for the strategy? So we often have policy ambitions and qualified statements. We want to achieve this and that. You're only providing a direction. So for the farm to fork strategy, it's important to know that we have quantified targets to be reached quite soon in 2030. And as in the introduction, it was already mentioned by Alejandra, reduction of 50% of the overall use of chemical pesticides is a clear-cut objective and is to be achieved. So similarly, we have quantified targets for fertilizer use, antimicrobials, and also for organic farming. So for sure, a strategy is not legally binding in the European Union, but it's up to achieve those targets because policies will be evaluated and policymakers will be measured on the effectiveness of such a strategy. So next slide, please. And one click further, please, in the presentation. Yes, perfect. You see here, to recap, we have an integrated approach linking social, environmental, and economic dimensions from the farm to the fork, so meaning from the farmer to the consumers, and you as food processors are somewhere in the middle and play a key role as intermediaries. And overall, to achieve the objectives in the strategy, you need a toolkit and a portfolio of instruments. And the strategy itself lists some instruments, but not for all objectives. It actually tells how they can be achieved in the best way. So you can use legislation, you can have financial incentives, education, advisory services, research and innovation. And research and innovation, for instance, will be key for digitalization, procurement, and so on. So there needs to be a portfolio of instruments. Next slide, please. So here I will only briefly touch upon because they're very European Union specific. So there are 2 concrete announcements in the strategy. One is the legislative framework for sustainable food systems, which is forthcoming in 2 years to go. And linked to the COVID crisis, it's also a contingency plan is planned for 2021. So they are less relevant at the moment for the specific purpose of this presentation today. So we will go ahead to the next slide, please. Yes, thanks. So here you see already a list of actions to ensure sustainable food production. I think linking for the European context to the Common Agriculture Policy is self-evident because it's the main program to support agriculture or the agriculture sector. Then it was already mentioned the Sustainable Use and Pesticides Directive, the review of regulation, organic sector is touched upon, and the integrated nutrients management was also mentioned, and you will hear more about it in the next days. So I would go, yes, exactly, and one step further also. If you look at the different actions to ensure sustainable food production on the second point, not all of them are relevant for you personally. But if you look, for instance, in the right corner on the top, these initiatives for enhancing cooperation for the primary producers, that could be, for instance, a key element which is also of interest for your sector. Next slide, please. And here also you see it's a portfolio of actions which is linked to the industry, retail, and hospitalization. So quite relevant for you. And I only pick out one of them, the proposal for the revision of the legislation on food contact materials. It's a concrete proposal which might directly concern you, for instance. Next slide, please. Yes, and here's the same. It's a range of actions, and we cannot go into detail here. But for the promotion of the shift towards healthier and sustainable diet, foods may play a key role, and fruit juice, you will see, it depends on what type of use you will produce. But for sure, the review of the school scheme, for instance, may play a role here. Or also the proposal for VAT or VAT rates to be adapted and to make it more targeted might also be important. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes. And that is an important element, I think, for your organization. So if a food system is global, then initiatives in the European Union ideally have also a promotion of a global transition. So it's about international cooperation and supporting the development countries in their transition towards sustainability is only one stepping stone. But it's also about including of ambitions in trade agreements or setting international standards for setting, and so to acknowledge them in the European Union. Or environmental aspects can be taken into account in assessing the request for import tolerance. For instance, if it comes to pesticides and certain thresholds there. And also labeling regimes can play a key role in promoting trade and what is accepted by the consumers or acknowledged by the consumers in the European Union. So even if some elements might not be binding in future, it's also about consumers' choice, for instance. Next slide, please. Yes, and if we now here go to the specific topic of this presentation, the implications of digitalization. How can digitalization and digital farming help to achieve the objectives of the farm to fork strategy? So as said, we have theoretically a portfolio of instruments available to make the strategy and transpose it into practice. So it can reach from legislation, from dedicated policy measures, interventions, for instance, supporting investments. It can be the adaptation of existing policy programs. For instance, the Common Agriculture Policy could be targeted with selection criteria for support projects. And so there is a range of portfolio of instruments. And if we look now more concretely on digitalization, next slide, please. And yes, all the elements, please. You see here that at the agriculture policies and the agriculture sector is in the European Union not only framed by the Green Deal. We have also headlines of vision like the digital age, economy that works for all. And then as operational level, we have not only the Common Agriculture Policy, but also Horizon Europe, which is a research and innovation program, and the Digital Europe program. Next slide, please. All these tools offer opportunities to promote digitalization. And in farming, digital technologies can, as you probably know, help the farmers to work more precisely and efficiently. They can also increase the sector's competitiveness and sustainability to the same time, which is important if we want to follow the integrated approach of the farm-to-fork strategy. At a social level, they can make the job of a farmer more attractive to younger generations and promote the sustainability at the social level of the sector. They can also help along the food chain to increase the transparency. So as they are in the middle of the food chain, this is also quite important. And they can support all types of farming. No matter whether you're organic or conventional, digital technologies can help small and large farms to perform better. Next slide, please. Now let's look at digitalization in the Common Agriculture Policy for the post-2020 period. So we don't have to go into detail here. One step further in the presentation, please. But what is important to know that the enabling potential of digitalization has also been acknowledged in the proposal for the Common Agriculture Policy as enabler to achieve the other sustainable development objectives manifested in the proposal or the legal proposal for the Common Agriculture Policy. So that tells us already that digitalization can play a key role. Next slide, please. So if we regard digitalization as one enabling tool, then that I already said, they can help to sum up economic and sustainable ambitions. At the same time, the effectiveness of digital technologies goes hand in hand with the data which is fed into digital technologies, and data technologies can help. So that we have to think together. Next step, please. Yeah. But at least for the European Union context, and here I have to say that may vary from continent to continent a little bit. But what we see for Europe is that the potential is at the moment not fully exploited. For instance, due to a gap in infrastructure, particularly broadband, awareness among farmers on digital technologies, and sometimes also about a lack of cost effectiveness. This is particularly a problem for small farmers, but also for larger ones. And finally, there's also a lack of trust among farmers in the operators in technologies, but also in data sharing, which is essential for making some technologies happen. Next slide, please. Now, coming back to the one precise target, namely the reduction of chemicals and pesticides, then we can clearly say, okay, precision farming can help here to reduce the amount because of the more tailored application and adapting to specific environment conditions, for instance. But then on the other hand, we still face the challenge that we cannot simply say, okay, that farmer is applying digital technologies, and what is then? We cannot automatically say pesticides are reduced by, for instance, 20% because he is using those technologies. We still face the challenge to really assess the impact digital technologies have in reducing emissions. Next slide, please. There are other challenges as well. So it's not only about the lack of ability to monitor and benchmark on the one hand what we can achieve in the impact, but also the data to know how many farmers are actually using and not only buying which technologies. So what is the uptake and what is the deployment in the agriculture sector? At least for the European Union context, we still face the challenge of avoiding a gap in the digital divide between small and larger farmers. And at the beginning, we mentioned, okay, the farm-to-fork strategy is about 3 dimensions, also social bonds. And the European Commission has as one headline ambition economy that works for all, meaning such a digital gap needs to be considered as well, thinking about small and large farmers if we want to go ahead with digitalization. And finally, we also have a social dimension. If we make a change in farming, we also have to think about the rural communities. So and that does not only apply to Europe, but also to the other continents, because automatically, if we have more digitalization, frequently, we may not always have a cut in positions, but the requirements for the positions in the agriculture sector to be set are more management-like if we have, for instance, more digital technologies in the farming process. So altogether, for the digital transition, research and innovation will be still a key feature to, for instance, achieve more cost-effective solutions. Next slide, please. So for exploiting the full potential of digital technologies, for Europe at least, it's still a need for strengthening the broadband, support the development of digital skills on the side of the farmers, but also of the advisors, enabling the exchange of information and experience. And I think that is also globally very important to have the exchange between continents, provide advisory services, facilitate investments. So, and here we can also think beyond a single farm. It might also be about cooperative investments in digital infrastructure. Providing data, so data as input to digital technologies, and help to facilitate data sharing. And here you may observe other European initiatives helping to do so. For instance, the commitment to establish a common agriculture data space and promoting targeted research and innovation. And here also most European programs are open also for third countries. That is maybe noteworthy to achieve common approaches. Next slide, please. For Europe, I would like to point to one declaration, the so-called Digital Declaration, and more precisely, the Declaration of Cooperation on a Smart and Sustainable Digital Future for European Agriculture and Rural Areas. So in that declaration, the potential, the enabling potential of digital technologies to achieve sustainability-related objectives, but also competitiveness of the farming sectors and of rural communities is acknowledged. And most member states of the European Union signed this declaration to join efforts to establish the digital and data infrastructure and to work together and to push in the design of the Common Agriculture Policy, but also of the Digital Europe Program and the Research and Innovation Program Horizon Europe towards those objectives to tailor, for instance, research and innovation to solution for small farmers, which is currently not covered by the private sector research and development, or to have a common infrastructure for agriculture data. So it really points to concrete actions and initiatives. One noteworthy one is, for instance, testing and experimentation facilities for AI. And you may now think about, okay, how is that related to the objectives of the farm to fork strategy? But if such testing and experimentation facilities test, for instance, digital technologies which are based on artificial intelligence to reduce pesticides, and they can develop then certain measurements, what emission reduction potential can be achieved, then there's a clear link between those interventions and the objectives of the farm to fork strategy. The same applies to so-called digital innovation hubs, which are intended, broadly speaking, please don't cite me on that, I have sent you the link at the end of the presentation, to link innovators in digital technologies with specific sectors and to the end users as the ground. For instance, a digital innovation hub may foster the agri-food sector and develop blockchain technologies to increase the transparency along the food supply chain. So insofar, that is quite important to make the implementation of the farm to fork strategy rolling. And that is a puzzle with different pieces on puzzles. It's not only about hard requirements, but also about capacity building In this case, in this presentation, on digitalization. So, and I think what is important in the declaration is the cooperation between member states. And I think the same applies to the farm to fork strategies. All stakeholders need to cooperate together to achieve the common objectives. Next slide, please. And with that, next slide, I would like to thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marquardt, to give us an insight on the future legislative initiatives, as well as the challenges ahead in implementing those technologies. We have now the possibilities to have some questions and answers, and please do use the Slido. You can access Slido through your scanning the QR code with your tablet or your mobile, or just follow the link on your internet. Alejandra, you have the floor to moderate the question and answer.
Thank you, Guta. One of the very first questions we have, as part of the digital technologies, we know that the use of drones for aerial spraying pesticides will be used in Europe. How will we cope with this use of drones if they have not been yet approved for use in the Sustainable Use of Pesticides Directive?
Okay, I think that's a very specific question, and that is not only about the targets of the farm to fork strategy. As said, the farm to fork strategy is a strategy and not a legal instrument. And I cannot make now a commitment for the individual actions in the forthcoming legislation. So meaning that is not settled yet, and actually targets two pieces or fields of legislation. On the one hand, the drones, and on the other hand, the forthcoming legislation on the use of pesticides. So both are announced for revision, or the legislation on drones is already in the process of being revised. So that's not up to me to decide on that. What I can tell you, I mentioned the research and innovation program. That, for instance, their activities are ongoing to assess the risk of drones in the relation to pesticides, to better be able to say, okay, what is possible and what is not possible. So it's clearly on the agenda, it's ongoing, but probably also in the forthcoming research and innovation program. So that I can say from my side, but I cannot say, okay, how will Parliament, Council and Commission decide on the forthcoming legislation?
Thank you. Another question is, we hope this involves collaborations with initiatives worldwide, showing that there are already many working solutions.
Yes, I think, and that is my personal opinion, that I think the international cooperation and the exchange of experience is quite important. But if we look, for instance, exchange of experience is particularly in the field of innovation support, for instance, through Horizon 2020, the research and innovation program, where we have, for instance, projects tailored to Africa. To only name one example, in agriculture and digitalization are digital innovation hubs in Africa, where knowledge transferred from Europe is adapted to the context in Africa. And so digitalization in the agri-food sector is transferred. But the same applies for sure for other continents, and Europe also has to learn a lot. So for instance, approaches developed in Africa can be relevant in the context of climate change for Europe in some case. There are several examples, and I think that is a key role to be considered.
Thank you. And last question quickly. Digitalization will bring benefits to farmers. However, it is well known that rural areas are pending for connection to internet, something that actually has been recently also observed by others, Cogeca. How the European Commission will address this to implement the digitalization strategies as part of the farm-to-fork strategy?
Yes, I think it's a top priority, not only in the farm to fork strategy, but also under the headline ambition of digital age is clearly outlined. For the Commission, its priority, and for instance, member states are required to have 5G implementation plans ready and revised by the end of the year. There are different investment tools potentially supporting member states to roll out broadband. So in the field of rural areas, it's not only about the common agriculture policy, where member states can apply for funding to roll out broadband. We have also a Connecting European facility, where you have more large-scale investments, where broadband can be funded. And also as it regards the development of new technologies to make, for instance, remote solutions available to, let us say, remote islands or smart villages, or let's say fields which are very far away where you would like to apply precision farming. There we have also research and innovation ongoing to allow, for instance, for remote 5G solutions in an area which is otherwise hardly covered with infrastructure. So I think also here we have a portfolio of instruments. It's not always in the hand of the Commission, but in the hand of the member states. But the European Union programs try to enable member states to make the necessary investments.
Thank you, Dr. McWhirter. Then we go back to the studio now.
Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you, Dr. Marquardt. I'm sure that there will be many more questions coming during the webinar itself, and maybe we can take them at the end of this webinar, all those questions that are still there. Now let's go to the third speaker. The floor is yours.
Our second speaker is the Emeritus Professor, Dr. Leslie Fairbank. Dr. Fairbank is an agroecologist concentrating on how land use and management affect the environment, especially in the UK. He has recently retired from Professor in Sustainable Agriculture at the University of Leeds and is a member of the EFSA GMO panel and chair of the EFSA Working Group on the Environmental Risk Assessment of Gene-Drive Modified Insects. He was a member of ACRE, the UK Advisory Committee on Releases to the Environment, from 2019 to 2015, before joining EFSA in 2018. He is former independent director of the Red Tractor UK Food Assurance Scheme. And with this impeccable resume, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Fairbank.
Good afternoon, and it's great to be here to talk to you about the potential role of GMOs in fruit juice production. My name's Les Fairbank. I'm from the University of Leeds, just about retired. And my background is that I'm an agroecologist. I'm not a geneticist. I'm not a specialist on the food chain, on fruit juice, on GMOs in terms of how they're actually produced genetically. I'm an ecologist by background, and I've done quite a lot of work over the years on the environmental risk assessment of GMOs. And as a result of that, I'm currently a member of the EFSA GMO panel. In other words, I'm one of the people that helps formulate the scientific advice for decisions about the regulation of GMO in Europe. I must emphasise that the talk doesn't represent the views of EFSA, it's purely my own views. And any factual errors in here are mine alone. And my own views in the talk are highlighted in yellow. So where you see yellow text on the slides, you know this is something that is personal. And I want to start at the end. Here, I want to start by giving you my take-home messages, if you like. First of all, GMOs will not solve all the problems about fruit production for your market. Secondly, they do raise concerns about naturalness and the commoditisation of agriculture amongst some consumers. By that I mean that they seem strange, not to be trusted. There might be features about them that are not safe or maybe long-term, maybe hard to detect. And also there are concerns about the role of big business taking over our food chain. However, in my experience, the general public is not anti-science. They're perfectly happy to go along with GMOs as long as they can see a benefit and as long as they can see that the risks are low and are properly being taken into account. So let's get started properly then. From my point of view, the key pressures on fruit juice production are, first of all, the new EU policies, sustainable use of pesticides, for the farm to fork strategy. The point I would like to make about these is that they leave the door open for GMOs, but not open very far. It's not assumed that GMOs will have an active role in fulfilling these policies. Secondly, there is always the pressure to innovate and compete. For example, my wife is allergic to grapefruit juice. Maybe a grapefruit juice without the allergen would be a useful, marketable item. Climate change is a major threat to food production. And it's not just changes in average temperatures, it's the extremes that we're increasingly seeing. This summer, it's been very much the fire and extreme temperatures in California. There are other things on their way, don't you worry. And not least, but new emerging pests and disease risks. And don't forget that just like COVID can spread around the world rapidly, the same is true for insect pests and crop diseases. Are GM fruit and vegetables the answer to these issues? Well, let's go back a bit. Just want to review briefly about how plant breeding has developed over the centuries and how GM plays its part in this. For thousands of years, people have been breeding plants and animals by selecting parents that have the characteristics, the traits that they want, and bringing them together. They don't develop new forms of variation in the population, they're simply using what is already there. But there's been real breakthroughs on this, not least the idea of hybrid vigour, that if you bring together two quite unrelated parents, the children, the offspring may well be fitter and larger. And also the idea of polyploidy, whereas some crops during this process have actually increased the number of chromosomes, which also gives rise to more productive, more vigorous plants. Wheat is the classic example. The conventional approach to plant breeding during most of the 20th century differs from this basically by trying to speed up the amount of variation in the population, putting more stuff in there. And that works by inducing mutation, by chemicals or radiation, and sometimes by using molecular methods and other methods to identify the desirable offspring. It gives you more scope, it gives you more speed, it gives you more precision. And then we come to GM, what I consider to be the first generation of GM. These are the ones that have been on the market since the mid-1990s. And these have been developed by taking genes from one species and dumping it into the crop. The species is often a bacterium. And typically, the characteristics that have come in that have been particularly successful are those that infer resistance against particular insect pests or against particular herbicides. And it's been possible to include molecular markers to make sure that you select the characteristics that you particularly want. And more recently, it's been possible to edit genes much more directly using approaches such as CRISPR-Cas9. And basically what this allows one to do is to create bespoke genes, not just cutting and pasting from elsewhere, but actually coding anything that you want if you know the genetic code for the characteristics that you want. This can include gene drives. I'll explain those in a few minutes. And as for the breakthroughs of these, well, I personally feel it's a bit too soon to say what they are. But the possibilities are huge. I want to go back to the regulation of GM crops. So how it works in Europe and through EFSA is that all GMOs that come into Europe must pass an evidence-based risk assessment. That's not just GMOs used for cultivation, but that also includes food and feed. The risk assessment addresses toxicity, allergenicity, environmental issues. The GMO panel that I sit on, we try and combine and assess the scientific evidence about these issues for a particular GMO. But we advise, we don't make the final decisions ourselves. The final decisions are political at the EU level. The process is slow and expensive. It is highly contentious, or certainly has been. And in my personal view, the use of GMOs has neither been a huge benefit nor an environmental disaster. CRISPR-Cas, the new approach to gene editing. First of all, make no mistake, this is highly contentious. As I say, it is seen by many as not natural. It's potentially much cheaper and easier to undertake than the first wave of GM crops. And importantly, the results of this are not always traceable. It's not always clear that these techniques are being used. This is used by some people to suggest that these things should be treated as ordinary breeding, because actually the effects that you get in CRISPR-Cas, you can't tell whether they came from CRISPR-Cas or from some other form of breeding. Importantly, there is no consistency around the world about how these are regulated. In the EU, these are going to be regulated in exactly the same way as GM crops of the first wave. And what's happening inside EFSA at the moment is that we're reviewing how best to do this. In other words, whether the approaches that are currently in place will still be fit for purpose for CRISPR-Cas and gene-edited plants and animals. But the idea is that however it works, they will be regulated. And this applies to the products as well as to the crops. The USA have taken a very different approach. They are not going to be regulated at all in the USA. Canada presents a third way. What they're doing is that they will regulate novel products, and that depends on what the product is rather than how it's been developed. So in other words, if one uses gene editing to recreate something that has already been available, that's fine. If one uses gene editing to create something that has never been found before, that will need to be regulated. The future of gene editing? Well, here's my personal guess. There is very high potential for using gene editing for quality traits and for yield quantity. Will they be able to deal with global heating and generalist pests and pathogens? I'm less confident about this. I think there's only so much that one can change crop plants so that they can actually be resistant to these things. I'm not convinced that CRISPR-Cas gene editing will make a substantial difference here. Happy to be proved wrong, and I don't know. As for public perception, my instinct is that consumers will be intrinsically cautious. But in the final analysis, it will depend on how much they trust how the products are being made and developed, and what are the costs and benefit considerations. I want to mention gene drives. Gene drives are a particular brand of gene editing, and these are particularly unnatural to many people, even though natural gene drives have been known for many decades. What happens here is that the genes of interest can be forced into a wild population, even against selection pressures, even if they reduced fitness. Even to the point that it's possible to force genes into our population that actually make that population extinct or make it change. The current focus is on insect disease vectors and insect pests. And the idea is either to knock out local populations of these pests, or to make them change. For instance, make the mosquitoes resistant to the malaria intrinsically to start with. There's also potential for using these techniques with weeds. Now, the reason why I mention this is that none of these techniques are yet commercially available, but they're close. And if they are released and are accepted, in terms of the fruit and the insect pests, it means that non-edited plants can still benefit from gene-drive approaches to pest control. In other words, it's still possible to argue that the fruit juice itself is non-GM, even if its production has benefited from a GM approach. That's a personal view. The key thing to remember about gene drive is that it's at the proof of concept stage. It's not there yet, but it's close. And key questions for the regulators and for the risk managers: if gene drive is released, will it carry on working indefinitely or will it break down? And if it's released and something's going wrong, is it possible to recall it? There's a lot of thinking going on about how to answer these questions. Concerns about loss of naturalness, which I've already alluded to. What I'm less sure about is whether those concerns will pass from pests and diseases to the main crops and main food items. So, as an agroecologist looking forward, here's my take. Don't expect instant solutions from the new technologies. Be climate change ready. In other words, if you start to lose production in some areas, should it be moved to other areas? For example, will different approaches to irrigation be required? Secondly, develop integrated pest management approaches. In other words, don't just rely on a single technology. Instead, see new technologies as part of your overall toolkit. And this may be GMO, it may be new biological forms of pesticide, or new ecological forms of managing pests. And in particular, be proactive with your consumers. You need to if you want them to adopt GM, you've got to work with them. Talk to people. Focus on the risks, costs and the benefits. Be transparent and be honest. How are these produced? So, the take-home messages again. First of all, GMOs will not solve all your problems about fruit production. They may help with some of them. GMOs raise issues of naturalness and the commoditization of food among some consumers. Respect those opinions. They're not anti-science. And as part of respecting those opinions, be open about the benefits of GMOs, their price and their quality, and if those benefits aren't visible for the consumers, are they real? They may make it cheaper for you, but unless those benefits are passed on, they're unlikely to be adopted by the consumers. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Fairbank, on this insight of, to say the least, a very political sensitive development. I'm sure there will be many questions, and I give now the floor to Alejandra to moderate those questions. Alejandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ute. One of the questions we have here is CRISPR-Cas9 is becoming a user-friendly tool for development of non-transgenic genome-edited crops. But does this really mean that we're using classical breeding techniques?
No, CRISPR-Cas is not classical breeding. What it allows you to edit the DNA very, very precisely, whereas classical breeding basically throws the DNA together to see what comes out of it. It is very, very different. What is interesting about it, though, in this discussion, is that it may be very difficult to actually look at the results of that to see whether they were developed using CRISPR-Cas9 or whether they were using conventional breeding. In other words, you might end up with the same place, but the pathway to get there is very different indeed.
Thank you. And it seems to be that there is a whole definition to understand what really CRISP is here in Europe and in the US. When it's about breeding technique or classical breeding techniques, why do you think is so different between countries?
The definitions of CRISPR are the same. How it's being treated is very different. And if you go back to the original definitions of GM crops, it was always about transferring genes from one species to another. And that made sense because gene editing wasn't possible at that time. Now, we've moved on since then, so CRISPR-Cas no longer falls in that earlier definition. And so there's been question marks as to whether it is part of that package or not. Mm-hmm. This is what the European Court of Justice ruled on, I think last year or the year before. And different regions have taken different attitudes on this. It really comes down to, are these new more powerful genetic techniques the same, basically an advance of GMO or an advance of conventional breeding?
Thank you. Now we go back to the studio.
Thank you, Alejandro. What I propose now is that we have a 10-minute coffee break and be back at 3:20.